Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to begin by posing a question, which is in fact a very and distinct, well, not distinctly, but it's certainly a very Jewish form of discourse. We always begin with a question. We never end up with an answer, but the question always remains at the end. My question is when viewed from the perspective of the Bible and later traditional Jewish rabbinic sources, is monarchy a preferred model of government? And I would suggest that those of you who are familiar with the trajectory of the biblical narrative, not only the biblical narrative itself, but the way in which it's been interpreted within both Jewish and Christian traditions, you might answer that question with an unqualified yes. Of course it is a preferred model of government, because no doubt many of you will think, for example, of the great King David, who in Jewish tradition, as well as Christianity, came to be regarded as the father of the Messianic line. What greater support for the idea of monarchy as a preferred model of government? But as we're going to see in the course of my presentation, both the Bible and rabbinic sources are very deeply divided on the question. And what I want to do is I want to begin by focusing my analysis on two key biblical texts regarding this question. One that is clearly an anti-monarchist tract, and the other one that at the very least is open to interpretation. But before I do so, a few brief words of context in order for the text to make some sense. Now, prior to the establishment of a monarchy in ancient Israel, the people were governed, as some of you will know, perhaps many of you will know, by a series of charismatic leaders. And I'm not using charismatic here in the sense of 6'4" and handsome and blue-eyed, whatever have you. But I'm using charismatic here in the much more fundamental religious sense of the word. That is, leaders who, according to the Bible, had been divinely appointed to carry out some task. So, for example, we have Moses, who was called on by God to lead the Israelites out of slavery in Egypt. We have Joshua, who was then commanded to lead them in battle to conquer the promised land of Canaan. And then finally, we have the period of the Judges, when the Bible tells us God sent the Israelites a series of leaders who were known as judges, not necessarily in the judicial wig-wearing sense of the word, but as really more military leaders. So God would send the Israelites a series of these judges whenever they got themselves into trouble. As I often tell my students when I teach this material, I often refer to this as a sort of an ancient form of crisis management. Now, during this period, the Israelites came under, that is, during the period of the Judges, they came under increasing military threat from hostile Canaanite neighbours, especially the Philistines. And it's against this backdrop that the people approached the very last judge who was mentioned in the Bible, that is, the prophet Samuel, and they demanded of him that he appoint a king as his successor for them. And the conversation that supposedly took place between them and Samuel is recorded in the first book of Samuel, chapter 8. And I want to read some parts of that selectively. So they come to him and they say, "Now appoint for us a king to govern us," and I emphasise the phrase here, "like all the other nations." But the thing, we are told, displeased Samuel. No doubt perhaps he felt some sense of rejection, and from this perspective, he then prayed to the Lord, seeking assistance as to what to tell them. And the Lord, we are told, said to Samuel, "Hearken to the voice of the people in all that they say to you, for they have not rejected you, but indeed they have rejected me from being their king over them. Hearken to their voice, but only you should warn them solemnly and show them the ways of the king who will reign over them." In other words, this is a version of a sort of informed consent. Before they are going to accept monarchy, let them know what it is that they are in for. The word "ways of the king" is very instructive because we lose a sense of it in the translation, but in the Hebrew, it is the word mishpat, which is very important. And this word often is used in the sense of denoting habitual behaviour. In other words, if you want a king, this is what you are going to end up with. So Samuel turns to the people and he warns them about the ways of the king. He says he will take your sons to be his horsemen, to run before his chariots, to plough his ground, to reap his harvest, to make his implements of war. He will take your daughters to be perfumers and cooks and bakers. He will take the best of your fields and vineyards, give them to his servants. He will take the best of your cattle and your asses, and you shall be his slaves." But we are told the people refused to listen to the voice of Samuel, and they said, "No, but we will have a king over us, that we again," the phrase is emphasised, "may be like all the other nations, and that our king may govern us and go out before us and fight our battles." So the Lord said to Samuel, "Hearken to their voice and make them a king." What the Bible then goes on to describe in quite lengthy fashion is the process by which the first king of Israel was appointed, and so on and so on. Now, what we have here is very clearly an anti-monarchical tract, and in fact, it's often presented by many people as the biblical point of view. But to do so, in fact, ignores that a much closer reading of the Bible reveals two contending factions in the politics of ancient Israel. So one of them preferred, if you want, an old-fashioned form of theocracy that was characterised by the leadership of devout men and women, for that matter, who felt called upon to lead, or if you want to judge, the people of Israel. And that's certainly one point of view that dominates for quite a long part of the biblical narrative. But then the other faction favoured the institution of monarchy, like that which characterised the various superpowers of the ancient Near Eastern world, and hence, in the mouth of the people, we have that claim we wish to be like the other nations. Now, quite remarkably, the Bible preserves the arguments for and against monarchy, and there are, in fact, quite a number of texts that support both points of view. Time, unfortunately, doesn't allow me, however, to go into them. However, I do want to look very, very briefly at another biblical text concerning this question, and I refer here to Deuteronomy chapter 17. And what I'm going to do is read verses 14 and 15 to you, but I'm actually going to read them in two versions. I'm actually going to read them in two translated versions, and I'll explain why I indeed have to do this. In the Jewish Publication Society translation of 1917, we read as follows: "When you come into the land which the Lord your God gives you, and you shall possess it and dwell therein, and you will say, I will set a king over me like all of the other nations that are round about me, you will be free to set a king over you, whom the Lord your God shall choose." In 1985, the Jewish Publication Society released another translation, said, "If, after you have entered the land your God has assigned to you and take possession of it and settled it, and you will decide, I will set a king over me, then you will be free to set a king over yourself, one chosen by the Lord your God." The key words are, of course, the opening words. One reads, "When you come into the land." The other one, "If, when you come in the land, this is what you decide to do." And if you're somewhat intrigued by how one would explain the difference in translation, it has a lot to do with the rather slippery and sometimes ambiguous nature of biblical Hebrew. That single word, ki, which opens up the passage, can in various contexts mean as, if, because, when, if, and so on and so on. So clearly what we have here are two versions of translation which have taken a sort of an interpretive approach to this rather ambiguous meaning of the biblical text. So depending on how you interpret the verse from Deuteronomy, you could argue on the one hand that monarchy was instituted in ancient Israel out of theological conviction. When you come into the land, you shall appoint a king for yourself. This is seen as a direct command for God. On the other hand, if you read it as if, when you come into the land, this is what you choose to do, then what we would argue is that Israel adopted monarchy not out of theological conviction, but out of historical exigency, and then retrospectively gave it a form of divine sanction. And what's particularly interesting about the text from Deuteronomy is that it also, in addition to what I have just read, also imposes a number of restrictions on the institution of monarchy itself. And it says, for example, following on from what I have just read, "You may indeed set as a king over you him whom the Lord your God will choose." And I want you to think about that in comparison to the very word of God to Samuel, where he says, "Appoint a king for them," at the end of the narrative. In other words, what is very, very clear here is that a restriction is placed on who is actually going to be appointed and who will actually do the appointing as well. The text goes on to say, "You should also appoint one who is from your brethren, and you shall set him as a king over you. In direct contrast, of course, to the people who come to Samuel and say, we want to have a king like the other nations around about us. And then the text goes on and says that this king shall not multiply wives for himself, lest his heart turn astray. Nor should he greatly multiply for himself silver and gold. He must not multiply horses for himself either. And of course, in Samuel, we have a very, very clear warning that if they appoint a king, this is what the king will indeed proceed to do: amass great gold and silver and abuse his power in all sorts of ways, and so on and so on and so on. So what's interesting, when we juxtapose the texts from Samuel and from Deuteronomy, which I have just read, we find that just as Samuel in the text warns against the excesses of monarchy, so too the book of Deuteronomy, which is essentially a legalistic text, legislates against such excesses. One is a warning against, the other one makes sure that such excesses should at least not occur. And then finally, of interest in Deuteronomy, are verses 18 to 20, where we go on and read, when the king sits on the throne of his kingdom, he shall write for himself a copy of this law, a copy of this Torah scroll, from that which is in the charge of the Levitical priests. It shall be with him, he shall read it in all the days of his life, that he may learn to fear the Lord his God, by keeping all the words of this law and these statutes and doing them, that his heart might not be lifted up above his brethren, that he may not turn aside from the commandment either to the right or to the left, so that he may continue long in his kingdom, he and his children in Israel. And what I think is very, very significant to keep in mind is that this very, very same law of Deuteronomy is a law that applied not only to the king, but to the people as a whole. I would suggest to you that what we have here is very, very possibly an early version, if not the earliest version, of some form of constitutional monarchy. Clearly a sort of a constitution which very, very much restricts and limits the power of the king. Now, interestingly, the debate about monarchy carried over into medieval Jewish thought as well. And again, a very few brief contextual observations are necessary to make sense of the text I'm going to speak about in a moment or so. And it is important to understand that when we read the views of medieval rabbinic thinkers about this particular issue, we also need to appreciate that their perceptions of sovereignty in the Middle Ages in particular were very, very limited. And the reason for this is that they lived in exile for hundreds and hundreds of years, either under Christian or under Muslim rule. Moreover, they nor anyone at that time could have even envisaged a modern nation state, nor could they envision a future secular state where most would not feel bound by some form of religious law. So when medieval rabbis engaged in discussion about the desirability of kingship and the conditions under which it should operate, they were thinking essentially in terms of a sort of future messianic national restoration in the land of Israel, where the Jewish people would ultimately be governed by a body of theocratic law. And what I want to do with that in mind is look briefly at the opposing Jewish medieval perspectives on this particular question. I want to begin here with Maimonides, who lived in the latter half of the 12th century under a relatively tolerant and open Muslim rule in Egypt at the time. And in a very, very important work, he writes, "We are commanded to appoint a king over ourselves." In other words, very important, interestingly, he reads Deuteronomy not as if when, but when you come into the land, this is what you shall do. He just sees it as a divine commandment. So we are commanded to appoint a king who will bring together our whole nation and act as our leader. He must be held in awe, and our unique respect for him and estimation of his greatness and prominence must be such as to place him on a higher level of honour than any of the prophets of his generation. When this king gives an order which is not in conflict with the commandment of the Torah, we must obey, and he has the right to put to death by the sword anyone who disobeys him. Now, what's very, very interesting is that Maimonides not only sees monarchy as theologically mandated by the Torah, but he also goes on to expand the powers of the king well beyond anything that was envisaged in the book of Deuteronomy itself. On the other hand, we have Isaac Abravanel, a 15th century Jew who lived under Christian rule, firstly in Portugal and then in Spain, and very, very importantly, was part of a mass expulsion of Jews in the year of 1492, which was decreed by the then Christian monarchs Ferdinand and Isabella. And he says this: "These three things are not necessary for the Israelite nation. They do not require a king for wars and for deliverance from their enemies, because Israel is delivered by God and he fights for them. Besides, their judges, who God appoints for them, goes forth and leads them in wars," and it gives on various examples. "Secondly, they do not require a king to lay down doctrines and laws. Why is that? Because Moses is the one who charged us with the Torah. And finally, nor is a king required in Israel to punish criminals, because God has granted that authority to the great court, the Sanhedrin. From all this, it is apparent that even if we grant that a king is necessary for other nations, he is inappropriate for the Israelite nation." And finally, he says the request for a king was not a sin explicitly denounced by the Torah, but I have said that it was permissible, deriving from one's evil inclination. Now, it's worth reflecting for a moment on the possible social and cultural influences on Maimonides and Abarbanel in attempting to understand what might have influenced their views. I want to suggest that Abarbanel's experience of monarchy was not a particularly positive one. He was a victim, as I said a couple of minutes ago, of a mass expulsion of Jews from Christian Spain, and the disaster which befell all of Spanish Jewry may very well have therefore contributed to his verdict on kingship, whose unchallenged tyranny could bring disaster in his eyes to an entire people. On the other hand, Maimonides lived under a strong and relatively benevolent caliphate in Cairo. I say relatively, it wasn't a bed of roses, but compared to the Jewish experience of Christendom, was in fact quite a positive one, at least for some period of time. And moreover, the caliph in the medieval Islamic state was the source of both religious and secular law. In fact, there was no division between the two, very much, if you want, the sort of theocratic model of kingship articulated in the Bible. Now, as far as modern Jewish political discourse is concerned, particularly in the state of Israel today, discussion has really never focused on the relevance of monarchy. However, the text from Deuteronomy, which I read a little bit earlier, has impacted on debates over the degree to which Israel as a Jewish state should be governed by Jewish religious law, because clearly that is the implication in the text from Deuteronomy, that a king should be held accountable to a body of religious law. I won't have time to expand on this, but perhaps for those of you who are interested, I'm happy to expand a little on it in the course of our panel discussion. Moving beyond Israel in particular, I would suggest also that the text from Deuteronomy also raises wider questions concerning the separation of church and state more generally. You heard before that for over a decade I was headmaster of a large Jewish school in Melbourne, and therefore as a religious educator, this particular issue of church and state has relevance for me, especially with regard to the current debate about the place of teaching religion in government schools. Again, I don't have time to expand on it, but perhaps in the context of the panel we might take that up. And finally, I want to, as I started with a question, I wish to leave you with a question as well. What is the relevance of my topic this afternoon for a symposium which has been focusing on the intellectual foundations of Western civilization? Well, to answer that, I will close by quoting from the dust cover of a very recently published book, published only last year, called The Hebrew Republic, Jewish Sources and the Transformation of European Political Thought. And we read as follows: according to commonplace narrative, the rise of modern political thought in the West resulted from secularization, the exclusion of religious arguments from political discourse. But in this path-breaking work, Eric Nelson, and I can tell you of some other writers who are doing the same, argues that this familiar story is wrong. Instead, he contends that political thought in early modern Europe became less, not more, secular with time, and it was the Christian encounter with Hebrew sources that provoked this radical transformation. During the 16th and 17th century, Christian scholars began to regard the Hebrew Bible as a political constitution designed by God for the children of Israel. Newly available, even rabbinic materials became authoritative guides for the institutions and practices of a perfect republic. This thinking resulted in a sweeping reorientation of political commitments. In the book's central chapters, Nelson identifies three transformative claims introduced into European political theory by this Hebrew revival. Firstly, the argument that republics are the only legitimate regimes. Secondly, the idea that the state should coercively maintain an egalitarian distribution of property. And then the belief that a godly republic, small g, should tolerate religious diversity. One major consequence of his work is that the revolutionary politics of John Milton, James Harrington, Thomas Hobbes appear in a brand new light. And a colleague of mine at Monash University, Professor Fania Salzberger, has also written about the impact that these Hebraists had on people like John Locke and Selden and others like him. And finally, we read here that Nelson demonstrates that central features of modern political thought in fact emerge from an attempt to emulate a constitution designed by God. This paradox, a reminder that while we may live in a secular age, we owe our politics to an age of religious fervour, in turn illuminates fault lines in contemporary political discourse. For those of you who are interested in the book, Eric Nelson is the author, The Hebrew Republic, and the other book to which I might refer you is a book called Political Hebraism, Judaic Sources in Early Modern Political Thought. Thank you.